Hi everyone, my name is Jo. I am from Australia, in case my accent didn't give it away. Today I'm going to be talking about usability testing and a little bit of UX stuff and a little bit of UX history, a little bit of statistics, which I know is a weird, scary thing for sometimes for people, but I wanted to get a bit of a feel for where you sit in the grand scheme of the things that I'm talking about. So just a quick show of hands if you work in like design, UI, that sort of space. Nobody, excellent. User experience, talking about like the things that people are doing. Yeah, no, okay. Development, excellent. You're the ones I want to talk to. What about like QA, QC? Anyone in that space? Nice, all right. We'll have lots to talk about as well. Anyone who doesn't fit into any of those other categories? No, okay. One, but I know her. I teach for her, so it's fine. We'll just ignore her. This is where I come from. You might notice it's a little bit different. We have Sun, which some of you guys might be familiar with from other months. It's big. There's like, I looked it up last night, I think there's 32 UKs in Australia. Like if you took the UK and then like tried to fit it in like a jigsaw puzzle, there's about 32 of them. But we have about 40% as many people as you do. So we're kind of just, we took the people and we just pushed them all to outside of Australia because the middle of it all looks like this. And I know what the middle of this looks like very well because that's where I worked for a long time. So I worked in a job doing what we in Australia call fly in, fly out. So it was on mine sites. My job was process engineer. And as a process engineer, I was working with lots of data and turned out that like most people didn't like working with the data that I was working with. And so I fairly rapidly morphed into working as a data analyst. And I was working as a data analyst and I was like, you know what would be great is if we had a database. And they were like, we have a database. It's over there in Excel. And I was like, that's not a database. They're like, that's fine. You'll get by. And I'm like, okay, if you don't give me a database, I'm going to build this in Access and you're going to have to support it for the rest of your lives. And so then they seconded me off to be a product owner so that they could build me a database and an application to go with it. And that was my first little dabble into software development. From there, I actually ended up leaving the mining industry and becoming a web developer for a while. I still do that a little bit, but it's not my sort of everyday job anymore. While I was working as a web developer, I started teaching for Kate, who's sitting here in the audience at the moment. She runs an organisation in Australia called She Codes. We teach women to become software developers so that they can switch careers, usually around sort of that mature age, looking to go back into the workforce. Then I became a software developer. Now that's mainly what I do is work on web applications, predominantly for charities. That's the main sort of area that I'm working in. And I'm also a UX researcher. And that might seem like a weird thing to tack on the end there. And the reason why this happened was because the thing that I loved about this job right up the start here as process engineer was the data. And we used to have this saying, in God we trust, everyone else give me data. The Australian version of that is less G-rated, but I can't say that on stage because this is going on YouTube. So I kind of missed that. I missed the data aspect of what I was doing. And yes, I was still working with databases as a software developer building web applications, but I missed the processing of the data and the analysing it and actually getting stuff out of it that I could make decisions from. And so that's why I kind of became attracted to UX research. So today I want to tell you a little bit about UX research from the perspective of the developer and why we should do it. And in particular, I want to talk to you about a particular type of UX research called usability testing, which is really poorly understood. So to give you a little bit of a high-level view of what usability testing is, there are a bunch of different types of UX research. And you might think that given that I came from that data-heavy background, I would lean more towards quantitative UX research. But what I actually found is that quantitative UX research is really hard and really inefficient to do. It costs a lot of money, and the stuff that you get out of it isn't necessarily isn't necessarily very effective or going to help you make a better product. So one of these things is not necessarily better than the other, but there are definitely better times to do them. And because I'm working predominantly with charities, I wanted something that was going to give me the biggest bang for my buck. So let's talk about quantitative UX testing. This predominantly focuses on comparing things because ultimately to do something that's quantitative, you've got to be able to measure it, right? It helps us to identify that there is a problem. That's the first thing that quantitative testing is really good for. If you're not sure and you want to see, can like 100 people get to this page and fill out a form, then maybe quantitative testing is something that is going to be useful for you. 60% of users were able to complete a task. That's the kind of thing we're talking about when we talk about quantitative usability testing. But it doesn't tell you what the problem is. And this is where the biggest challenge lies with quantitative UX research methods. They're really good for comparisons. So if you're looking to benchmark against a previous version or against a competitor's site, quantitative is a good way to convince people to make decisions, right? It's a good way to get buy-in from people who are higher up, who are deciding whether or not you should do a new project. But participants are really expensive. And one of the challenges with quantitative testing is that it has to be statistically relevant. So you can't do quantitative testing with a handful of users. You have to have enough people to make it statistically significant. And just to give you a ballpark, that's usually around 20 users. For most types of quantitative testing, you're looking at about 20 users. If it takes each of those people an hour, that's 20 hours of testing. If that needs to be facilitated, that's 20 hours of your time plus 20 hours of their time. And if they're not internal users, then you're probably also going to have to pay them. So that can become very expensive very quickly. It also requires a lot more knowledge to be able to process quantitative UX data. Because when you are looking at UX data, it's not like all yes or no stuff. Often it's things where you're having to put it into probability models and that sort of thing to actually get something valuable out of it. And even then, we're finding that it's not particularly great. And part of the reason for that is that when we are doing something that's based on this probability idea, is that we're narrowing it down to kind of what the majority, the kind of center of people are finding good or okay. And we're kind of excluding the people that are on the tail of that bell curve, right? The people who potentially are going to struggle the most. And ultimately, after you've done all of this, it still doesn't answer the why of why you have a problem. It only tells you that you do have a problem. So we're going to have a look at qualitative testing today. And what does that mean? How do we do it? And why should we do it? Well, the why is really easy, actually. It helps identify what the problem is. That's ultimately the point of qualitative testing. Study conditions can be varied between the sessions, so it's not like an experiment where we have to lock everything in and have the exact same experimental conditions for every single test. If we find a bug, we can fix it after the first test, and then we can run the same test again. And that's not losing data because we already know it's a problem. If it's a problem for one person, it will be a problem for someone else. You're not looking for reproducible statistical conditions, and you can use more realistic data for testing because of that. So when you are doing quantitative testing, let's say that we're testing a web form, right? If you were doing quantitative testing where you were actually measuring the success rate for completion, you would probably give fake data to your users to put into the form. And the problem with fake data is that you know that it's going to be correct. And what you don't know is whether they're going to understand what it is that they're meant to be doing there. You don't know whether they're going to put spaces in when you didn't expect them to put spaces in. So doing qualitative testing means that you can be less rigorous and more flexible with the way that you're getting to them to do the tasks because you're not actually the one telling them how to do it. They're the ones figuring it out on their own. So that's another really good reason to do qualitative testing. If a certain task doesn't give you what you need, let's say I go through a user test, it takes me an hour, and I'm like, at the end of that, I could not tell whether or not that person was able to do the task because they didn't understand the question. I don't have to just keep giving that bad question 19 more times. I can just change the question for my next test. The recommended number of people to do qualitative usability testing with is 4 to 6. So generally we say 5, do a round of 5. If you get 4 through and you're like, we've got so much great data, we're just going to go away, do a bunch of changes and then do another round, excellent. If one of them is a bit of a flop because you're like, we tried to do the testing and the first one found so many bugs that they couldn't even get through the third task, then do 6, right? But either way, it's still a lot cheaper and a lot less time consuming than the 20 that you need for quantitative usability testing. So it's much cheaper, it's much easier to arrange. You can, and honestly, nowadays will do it online. You don't need to have people there in person. There are little situations where maybe you need to, but we'll talk about them in the end. And with 5 users, just 5 users, a qualitative study, so one round of a qualitative study, is likely to uncover around 85% of the usability problems in your project. That's mad. Like, that's an insane stat to have. And we know this from thousands and thousands of people doing rounds of usability testing. Iterative testing with smaller groups is going to be way more practical and efficient at finding the problems in your project than doing one massive study and then just hoping that you catch everything at that point in time. Because if you have to go fix things, that means you're going to have to do it all over again to actually realize whether or not you have solved the problems. So hopefully I've convinced you all that you should be doing qualitative testing. How am I doing so far? Yes, are we all converts? Excellent, terrific. Either way, if you decide not to do any testing at all, I want you to know it's still going to be tested, you just don't have control of it. It's going to be users who are going to be really annoyed and they're probably going to whinge at you and it might cost you money and it's definitely going to cost you time. The best place to do testing is like yesterday. If you can't do it yesterday, then do it now. You don't have to wait until you get to a particular milestone. Yes, you probably want to have at least wireframes to be able to do usability testing, let's be real. But you don't have to have it 100% finished, and it doesn't need to be a new project. You can usability test at any time. I'm just going to grab a glass of water. I just like to build the suspense, you know. All right, so who wants to know how to run a qualitative user test? Hopefully I've convinced you that you should do it now. These are the steps. Thanks. We can go, no. Okay, so the first step is to recruit participants, and I include this because it's actually one of the most challenging and most important parts of this entire thing. So how do we recruit our participants? Well, the first and most important thing to notice is that you are not the person that we are wanting to recruit. You, specifically, are a bad choice, right? The only time when you are the right person to be usability testing with is if I have a developer tool, because then you are the end user. But 99% of the time, that's not going to be the person that you want to go to for usability testing, right? You want to make sure that you are finding the right kind of people to be doing the testing with. And these kinds of people aren't necessarily your average user. Like, you do want to have some of those. You want to have some average users. But you don't want them all to be just the status quo, because those people are probably going to be able to get by even if your product is a little bit rubbish, right? Typically, we want users who don't have a lot of knowledge about either tech or usability testing. That's the first thing, because if they do, they're kind of gaming the system a little bit and you're not going to get as good value out of them. If I ask a web developer to look for like bugs in, or to do a usability testing for a website, the things that they're looking at are not going to be whether or not my website is easy to use. The things that they're going to be looking at is whether or not I'm a good web developer, right? Because they're just comparing me and their work. That's not a good person to have doing your usability testing. Do you know who is the best person to have doing your usability testing? Your mum. Because I bet that regularly she's calling you up and is like, I've got this problem. I clicked on this link, and now, I mean, maybe not your mum, but your grandma, certainly. Your next door neighbor who's like 80 years old, she's excellent for doing usability testing with. You want to try and get people who are going to be the ones that struggle the most, because if they can have a great experience using your product, anybody can. They're not necessarily going to be easy to find, but there are some things that we can do to kind of weed out and identify who those people are. So some of the things that we like to ask is like, would you consider yourselves technical, right? And I love this question because I need you to deep down be really honest with me right now, okay? Just everyone close your eyes, because we're not here to shame. I want you to put your hand up if you've ever unironically said, I'm not very good with tech. Okay, you can put your hands down now. You can open your eyes. I guarantee you that there were hands up in this audience. You're at a tech conference, guys. Okay, like I've said it. I've been like, I'm not very good with computers. Like, I'm not very good with computers compared to my husband who worked in IT since he was out of high school. But do you know who I am really good at computers compared to? My mum, my dad, my great-grandparents. So everything is really on a scale, and sometimes asking people straight out a question like, are you good at tech, is not going to give you the answers that you need. So you have to hack the system a little bit here. And you ask questions in your screening questionnaire that are going to help guide you to those answers of how tech savvy they are without actually asking them how tech savvy they are. So for example, rather than asking how comfortable are you using technology, you might say, how do you regularly access the internet? And if they say, on my phone, and that's the only answer that they give, that's a good indication that they're probably not working in a technical job and they're not on a computer every day. If they say, from my MacBook, blah, 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 and they rattle off the model number, and they're like, also I have this tablet and the latest, like, 3-fold Pixel phone or whatever, you're like, okay, that person's in the tech savvy range, right? You can tell a lot about how people answer questions like this. So free text, like in your recruitment questionnaires, free text questions are gold. Yes, it takes a little bit longer to pass through them, but like, honestly, you can get an LLM to do that for you nowadays. So things like, how do you regularly access the internet? Tell us more about the devices you might use to access a website. That's a great one. The language that they use is really informative. Whether or not they list multiple devices. Which of the following tasks would you be confident helping a friend or family member with? This is another one of my favorites. And some of them are like installing a piece of software on my computer, or installing an app on my phone, or registering a domain name, right? And you guys might be like, well, registering a domain name is pretty easy. And it is for us. I'm sure that any of us could go and figure out how to register a domain name right now, even if we'd never done it before, because we would just Google it. But if my mum ever needed to register a domain name, the first thing she would do is call me, right? Because she wouldn't have the first clue about how to go about that. So this is a great way of being able to vet people without them knowing necessarily that you're vetting them. And consider asking questions that are specific to your industry. So we work a lot in the charitable space, as I mentioned before. And we often will ask participants if they have experience volunteering with specific areas. So we do a lot of work with charities that are in the helping women space, so domestic violence, homelessness, that sort of thing. So we'll often ask questions that are relevant to this. Have they ever worked in the family domestic violence sector before? And sometimes we want people who have worked in that sector because they're the target audience. They're the people that are going to be using the website or the application. And sometimes we specifically want people who aren't in that sector because we want to test, for example, whether the terminology that we've used, whether the language that we've used, do they know what FDV means, or do we need to specifically say domestic violence or family violence? So last note on that, because we work predominantly for charities, we're really lucky because we can just put a call out on social media and say, hey, we need usability testers. Here's our recruitment survey. Can you take that if you want to help us out and just donate an hour of your time? And that's great. And people are happy to do that when it's going to a good cause. But unfortunately, you can't do that if you are going to a big global corporation that is paying for you to go to NDC. So probably if you're here, probably, not everyone, but there's a good chance that whoever you are usability testing with, you're going to have to pay. And generally speaking, it's around 100 of whatever your local currency is. If you're a Western country, so £100 or 100 US dollars or 100 Australian dollars, wherever you are is usually the going rate. I don't know why, because £100 is 200 Australian dollars, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles. So maybe come to Australia if you want to do usability testing. But honestly, $500 to find 85% of the, or £500 to find 85% of the bugs in your software, I think we can all agree that that's a pretty good deal. All right, so we've talked about recruitment. What's next? Research questions. So this is not the things that we're going to ask people to do. This is the things that we want to find out. And there are like 4 kinds of research questions. So the first type is usability, and these are kind of the easiest ones to actually identify. So this is, can people do a thing, right? So a good example of that is like, can they submit the form, or can they use a particular tool that you've created? Can they, let's say that you've got like a fancy new AI tool and it does software or image generation, and you're like, can they generate an image, right? That's an example of usability. Findability is a little bit more complex. So that is, they know that a thing exists on the website. Can they find that thing, right? So someone's gone to a website, they've been told there's a directory there, or they're in a piece of software, and they know in that software somewhere there is a way to reset their password, right? We all know that there's a way to reset the password. If I've got a user account, I'm going to have a way to reset my password. Can I find that thing? That's findability. That's different from discoverability. Discoverability is, can that person find that that thing even exists? So we all know that we can reset our password, but did we know that there's the ability to change from dark mode to light mode? Right? Is that a thing that people ever find, or does everyone just use it on the default mode and assume that that's what there is? And the last one, which is really hard to test for, and is actually the one instance where I would recommend that you look at a quantitative option instead of qualitative testing, is engagement. And engagement is best done using lots of data, not just 20 people from a single usability test. It's better done using things like Google Analytics or Hotjar or Microsoft Clarity or something like that. And that's things like, are people going to stay on my site because they're finding my content valuable? Because you're not really going to be able to answer those things from a qualitative test particularly well. You might get feedback on tone and stuff like that, which can be really great, but it's not necessarily going to tell you about how engaging it is. So once we've worked out our research questions, and often these things that we're looking at for our research questions are going to be the things that maybe we are arguing about a little bit throughout the process. So I'm sure you can all imagine or have been in the situation where you're working on a project and 2 different people who are working on the project, maybe it's the senior and the person who's doing the work, or the customer and you, or even you and another teammate, and you disagree on the best way to do something. And one person wins, right? And so you're now in a situation where either you're the person who won, and you have to prove that you made the right call, or you're the person that didn't win, and spitefully you want to make sure that that other person knows that they made the wrong call, right? They're your 2 options. So usability testing is a great way to identify whether or not you made the right call. Now, it's important that you don't let the way that you phrase your task be swayed by your opinion on the research question that you're trying to answer. So if the research question is like, is this the right word to use for this particular label that we've got on something, right? Like, this is a really common thing that we come across in usability research, is like, language is super important. The way that we name things is really important. So often we will name things based on domain knowledge that we have and just assume that everyone else understands what that means. And I'm sure we've all done it. So that can be a big risk, particularly if you're working like we are in sort of sectors where you've got a lot of people who maybe aren't English first language, who don't have a very high literacy, level or who are perhaps older than yourselves. So be careful when you're creating your research tasks, but be even more careful when you're creating your activities that you're giving people to do. So once you've got the questions, the things that are like, our hypothesis is that this is bad, and we want to prove whether it is or not, or we want to know whether people can use this thing that's really important to our organisation. These are the sort of things that you should have in your research questions. Research tasks, however, are what we ask the participant to do. And the way that we word our tasks is really, really important because it's going to change the way that our participants approach it. So here are some examples of the different types of tasks that we might set. So sign up to the platform using the coupon code freebie, right? This is an example of a usability task. Can they sign up and create a user account, and can they do it using a coupon code? Findability, change your email address. You know that there's a way to change your email address, or you know that there's a way to change your password. Can you do it? Discoverability, use the tool to work out the most likely geographic location shown in this photograph, right? This is maybe you've got a tool and it's like there's an option to upload a photograph and you're trying to see whether or not they can actually find the ability to upload the photograph, or are they just going to type it in a description of what the photo shows. So in this instance, you're like, can they actually see that they can upload a photo here? And lastly, with engagement, find a place you would like to visit on holiday, right? Like browse my, I don't know, holiday site. I'm sure there's a lot more money in that than charity. But I want to ask you just really quickly, so has anyone seen this picture before? Yeah, a few? I mean, one of them because she's seen this talk 2 other times before this, but I want you to quickly tell me how wealthy are the people in this picture? All right, now I want you to tell me the ages of the people in this picture. Now, if you are like the majority of people, for the first question, your eyes would have gone like this, because you would have been taking into account their clothing, you would have been taking into account the furniture, whereas when you're looking at their ages, you're predominantly looking at things like their height and their facial structure. So the way that we word a question is really important in the way that people will look at something. So the order in which you ask questions is also really important, because if you've already given something away in an earlier task, then that's going to impact the way that they complete a follow-up task. Does that make sense? Yeah? So tasks can be either exploratory or directed. They can be kind of fairly broad and wide open if you're just trying to understand a little bit more about the way that they're going to use something, or they can be really sort of targeted on, you know, sign up using the freebie code. Exploratory is really good for testing engagement and interest, like see if you want to invest in this company or find a place where you'd like to go on vacation. But directed tasks are usually better and often what we end up using the majority of the time, because they're usually answer oriented with like some kind of measurable success rate. There's either they were able to do the task or they weren't. So even though we're not measuring and trying to look for statistical success here, we can still identify, was this task easy or hard to do? And did they have problems being able to complete that task? If you scan the QR code at the end, there is a link to the full research study that this eye tracking example comes from. It's really interesting. There's a whole bunch of different questions that they ask people, and it's one of the kind of founding studies on eye tracking, which is really fascinating if you're a data nerd like me. So here are the golden rules for creating research tasks. And honestly, if you forget everything else that I tell you in this talk, this is probably the most important thing, but also if you're one of those people that takes photos and then forgets it, just scan the QR code at the end, because my blog post has all of these examples in it too. Don't make up a complex scenario. This is probably my #1 rule, is like, don't overcomplicate it unnecessarily. It can be really tempting to over-engineer our tasks, but it's better to keep it as simple as possible so that, first of all, people don't get distracted or potentially confused, but also because it could unintentionally end up being offensive. And so particularly in the area we're working in, for example, we try and avoid saying things like help a family member to do this when we're looking for a directory of family and domestic violence services. Like just say, find an example of a law service for this particular thing, because we don't want them to start thinking about potential family domestic violence in their families' lives when we just want to see whether or not they can use a tool, right? And we also want to make it really clear what the task is. We don't want them to be trying to figure out what the task means instead of trying to figure out how to do the task. We said help someone find instead of what would you do if you needed to find, because it's more concise. And it also makes it clear that you want the participant to actually do that thing instead of just tell you how they would do that thing. So, once we have our tasks, what do we actually do? The next step is facilitating, and I have some golden rules for facilitating usability testing. This is something that I do a lot of, and I'm really fortunate because most people have to, try and convince their boss to let them do usability testing, but I just get people to tell me that they want me to do it instead, which is really nice. It's a great gig, but always record your session. Like, always record your session. Doesn't matter if it's in person or if it's digital, but always record your session. Always make sure that you get permission from people before you record it. Don't ever record people without their permission. Obviously, that goes without saying. Make it really clear that you're testing the website and not them. This is like the number one thing that I explain to people. I'm like, if you can't complete an activity that I give you, that's not on you. You're not the problem. Because we're not here to test you, we're here to test whether or not this application works. Ask them to think out loud, and you might have to coach them on this a little bit because it feels really weird, unless you're a conference speaker, in which case that's just your status quo. But most people don't like hearing themselves talk for 60 minutes. It's a weird experience for the vast majority of people. And I also always like to send my tasks in writing as well as getting them to verbalize it. And the reason for that is that I will often find that they will refer back to that task like 4, 5, up to 10 times while they're doing it, particularly if it's something that's a little bit more complex, just to make sure that they've understood the task and not forgotten what it is that they were trying to do. Because they're also under stress. You're watching them do this and they're really nervous. So just keep that in mind. Have empathy. Don't have lots of spectators because it's scary being watched by one person. It's even more scary being watched by 6 people. Once you reach critical mass, it becomes less scary, so thank you for showing up today. Don't talk to the participant while they're doing it, and this is really hard. I'll show you an example of what it feels like to do a usability test in a moment. And don't take it personally if they can't do the thing. That's the whole point. That's why we're here. We're doing usability testing because we want to know whether or not people can use our piece of software or our website, right? If everything comes back hunky-dory, that's great, but it's not really telling us anything, so we've just wasted these 5 user tests. So it's a good thing. If they can't complete a task, that's a good thing. Just remind yourself of that when you're like, no, but it's so easy, just, right? Because this is what it feels like. This is exactly what it feels like. Do we want to have a guess where he's going to put it? One more? Soul crushing, right? That is exactly what it feels like doing a usability test, but you can't say anything. You have to mute yourself, right? You have to mute that microphone and just rage yell at the screen. That's fine, they can't hear you. Have your video off, obviously, otherwise that would be weird. Have your video out, you rage yell at them, take notes, but don't say anything because you're going to ruin the whole purpose of the usability test if you say something to them. Don't guide them. If someone asks you during the test, what should I do now? Do I click this thing, right? What would you do if I wasn't here? That is the golden line that you're going to use over and over again. What would I do? What would you do if I wasn't here, right? This is my exact script, also in the blog post, so you don't have to take a photo of it. This, I basically more or less read it out verbatim when I start a usability test to talk through what we're going to be doing, make sure that they're comfortable. But I think a better way of showing you is actually to show you a little demo that I recorded with a friend of mine. And this is like a little task that I tend to do before I start my usability tests, just to get them into the habit of talking out loud, because as I said, it's a really weird feeling. So this is an example of how I would start a usability test facilitation.
So I'm going to ask you to work on one activity at a time, And when you're doing the activity, go as far as you would if you were doing this on your own. And then when you complete the activity, say like I'm done, or I would stop here. And if you ever get to a point where you would leave the site and go somewhere else or do something other than use the website that we're testing, you could just stop there and let me know. At this point I would go to, and then the name of the site that you would go to, or the action that you would take. For example, I would probably give up here and go and Google XYZ. Right? Sure. I'm also going to ask you to think out loud while we're doing the activities. And it really helps us if you can talk through your actions and what you're thinking and what your thought process is as we're going while you're using the site, rather than like trying to remember it and then us dig that out of your head later. And it's going to feel super weird and uncomfortable as you're monologuing, but I promise it's going to be worth it, at least for us. So we'll do a test run and get you into the right mindset and make sure that you're comfortable with the process. And finally, it really helps us if we can see how people are using the website without prompt, so without any assistance. So I'm not going to say anything as you're doing the activities. Sure. And I promise I'm not going to be ignoring you. I will be taking notes in the background, and I might ask you some questions at the end about your experience. The only time that I will prompt you is if you are quiet for a bit. I might ask you what you're thinking or something like that. Do you have any questions before we get started?
No, I do not.
Okay, I'll get you to share your screen for me, Dee, and then to help you get into the think aloud mindset, I'm going to get you to do an example task that is just completely for fun. So I'm going to share the task in the chat for you, and I'd like you to first read it aloud for us, and then give it your best shot, making sure that you are talking aloud as you go. All right, let me pop this into the chat. Go for it.
Find a website on Google that will generate you some fun filler text that you can use as a placeholder when creating a visual design with large blocks of writing. Okay, so that sounds like I'm looking for a lorem ipsum generator. So I would open my search engine. Here's one I prepared earlier.
All right, I'm going to stop that there. Because you don't need to see her. In case anyone wants the spoiler, she came up with Pirate Ipsum. It was great. The video of that is also on YouTube if you do want to see the whole lot of it all the way through. So there's a few things that I did there that you might have picked up on, but I'm going to point them out just in case you didn't, because they are really important little quirks, little tricks that we do during facilitation to make sure that we're getting the best possible result. So the first one is, actually just going to go back here, is that I turned my video off while Dee was completing the task. So did you notice as soon as I was done talking, I turned my video off? That's because I don't want her to get distracted by seeing my facial expression when I'm like, why aren't you doing the thing right? So turn your video off as soon as you can, as soon as it's practical and polite. Use the term activity instead of tasks. Did anyone pick up on that one? So I never actually said the word task. That's a very conscious decision. We call them activities when we're talking to the user. And that's because task implies that there's a right answer, and they feel a lot more pressured. So calling it activity makes it sound a little bit more open-ended. And the last thing is that obviously I used a demo activity to familiarize her with the process before actually getting right into it. So if they're super nervous, you can even do the demo activity as a demonstration and talk through it so that they get a feel for how much verbalization you're expecting from them. So I have had to do that, particularly when I'm doing testing with younger people. So I've had to do some with like teenagers, and I find that often they go one of two ways. They either don't shut up, or it's really hard to get them to talk because they're super nervous. So this is an example of a scorecard that I'll fill out at the end. So I ask them the same 3 questions every time. And these questions are a little bit confusing at first glance because the first question is really obvious. How easy or hard was it to complete this activity? That's fine. But the second one is, how confident are you in your answer of how easy or hard it was to complete this activity, which is very meta, right? Does anyone know why we ask this question? Except for those 2 who have seen this talk like 4 other times. No? So the reason why we ask that is because it helps us understand, was the problem that they had completing the activity that they didn't understand the question? Or was the problem that they didn't know how to do the activity? So if they're like, I'm not sure whether or not it was easy or hard because I didn't really know what I was meant to be doing in the first place, that's an indication that the problem is not necessarily with your product, but with your question. And the last one is, how satisfied are you with the end result? And this is just really useful because if nothing else, it often will make you feel better if it took them like 13 minutes to get to the thing that you expected them to take 30 seconds to get to. But then they're like, but once I got there, the content was really good, then at least you feel like marginally better about it then. They're like, it looked really pretty once I found it. So if nothing else, it's a nice little like ego boost at the end. But it can also be really helpful the other way around. Maybe they were able to find it really easily. They were able to land where you expected them to land, but perhaps once they got there, they didn't actually really know whether or not the result was what they were looking for or what they wanted to do. And so the last step is to just iterate this over and over again. So this is an example of a project that we work on called yourtoolkit.com. It's an Australian site. They're embarking on creating the first national directory of services for people who are experiencing family domestic violence. And we did a bunch of rounds of usability testing on their new platform. And there were a bunch of things that came out of this, and you can see that we've color-coded these. And so that's actually, this is what we do. So we do this all in Miro. It's not fancy. You can use, like Figma's got a competitor product. You can use whatever your internal thing is that you use, like a whiteboard. You can use sticky notes. It doesn't matter what tool you're using to actually consolidate all of your results from this. The only rules that we have is that you take good notes, and good notes are not things like, the customer liked it. That's a terrible note. The customer didn't like it, also a terrible note, right? Things like, I wish there was an icon on this, or I didn't understand what this word meant, or the user took a really long time to find this particular thing, or the user complained that that wasn't very intuitive at this particular point. The way that we set this up is, I don't have an example of it, but we have like swim lanes kind of thing. So we'll have a screenshot of each of the screens that they interact with. And then we have basically a column for each of those screens. And so we will just whack sticky notes on that column whenever someone makes a comment, and we color code them based on which user it was. So orange is user 1, pink is user 2, green is user 3. And so that way it allows us to see, did one particular user have a lot of problems with this? And if so, was there something unique about that user that meant that they had those specific problems? Is there a specific target group that we need to be doing more research with? Or was it something that a lot of people had the same comment about? So that's why the color coding is really valuable there. It's such an easy thing to do. It's also really visual and easy to show to stakeholders, right? And that is super important because often one of the reasons we do usability testing is because we need a budget for something, right? As a developer, I'm sure you've been there where you're like, this sucks, and I know it sucks, and I want to fix it, but I need someone to pay me to fix it, right? I need buy-in from people to be able to do this. It's a lot easier to get buy-in to do a moderately cheap round of usability testing than something that you know they're going to have to pay a team of developers for a year to be able to build or fix. So often being able to show them something that's really visual like this and say, look, we put this task in front of them. It's the most important thing that our users need to be able to do. They need to be able to sign up for a credit card, or they need to be able to sign up for a life insurance policy, or they need to be able to, I don't know, what do you guys work in? Like, I just know that NDC tickets are really expensive, so probably something that makes a lot of money. So whatever it is that you need people to do that makes your company a lot of money, if they can't do that thing, then you need to fix that. And this is a great way of being able to show the people who are making decisions that they should be investing time and money into fixing those things. Final reminder, you are not the user. Please make sure that you are, at the very least, testing with people who are not you. And even if you don't go through and do, say, a full usability testing round where you're like, going through and doing this 5-step process and recruiting people and coming up with research questions and converting them into clever tasks and then iterating that and doing up a nice Miro board that shows all of the feedback that you get and then consolidating that and sending it to someone. Even if you're not doing any of that stuff, consider testing your product with your mum. Like, if you take nothing else away, consider testing it with someone who you wouldn't normally test with. Obviously, if your product is something that requires authentication and is an internal product, that becomes a little bit more challenging. But maybe you've got a secretary or something, someone who is part of your organization but not an everyday user. Maybe you have someone in your organization who doesn't use that product every day, who you could test with, that maybe would be an example of your mum, right? Your person who's my mum. Really push yourself to do that, and if at all possible, try not to lead them along the way. So even if you're just sitting next to someone and asking them to do a task, even if it's just one task, try not to give them hints, try not to guide them through it, just let them do the thing and learn to watch, because you'll become a much, much better developer because of it. I know I have. So all the resources that I promised are on the QR code if you want to take a photo of it.